So this is part of the negative course here. That's the negative course. And this month, I'm going to talk about, and then we'll discuss PMS. And the essay that I wrote for this month is Feminist Depressive Realism, PMS and the Tragic Grace of Cheerfulness. That's the full title. It's I'm really excited to talk about PMS, and I was waiting for it for quite a while, and I realized I'm probably the only one who was waiting for it. This topic is problematic because as a result of this kind of thoughts, I might be kicked out from both, from depressive realism and from feminism, because they contradict each other. And if you want to be depressive realism, it's kind of problematic to combine it with being feminist, and the other way around. So first, what I'm talking about is presenting, and this is something that was bothering me for a while, as someone who belongs to pessimist, philosophical pessimism tradition, and to depressive realism. At least that's what I consider myself to be. The problem for me is that ultimately, at the core of what they're talking about is this kind of suffering that Schopenhauer is talking here already in The World as Will and Idea. So it's the suffering that is associated with intellect, with highly developed consciousness. And in this quote, it also, and from the beginning, it's also anthropocentric. So it's about human suffering that is different from other animals who suffer less because they're less smart. But we won't discuss it here. What bothers me today is that it's male-centered. And because in every philosophical pessimist and in the philosophy and theory of depressive realism, you kind of can sense it, that it's about male suffering because it's about suffering of the intellect. And intellect is associated historically with the male trait, something masculine, and therefore it's the suffering, we can say, the suffering of males. So this rhetorics of depressive realism, boiled down, might be seen as the despair of man, not of a woman. And Schopenhauer is important here because he's not only known for his pessimism, but he was one of the worst, maybe, if you if you can say so, one of the worst misogynists. He didn't really like women, and he's openly saying here it's more problematic than that, but nonetheless, it's valuable, maybe it's reasonable at least to say that for Schopenhauer, it is suffering of man openly. And he would claim, for example, that woman has less to do with mental or physical work, or they're not capable of great mental work, and worse other horrible things about women. And unfortunately, I don't think that this bias that women are less smart, can be just taken away from those philosophical pessimism tradition and just preserve it, the rest of it. It doesn't work like that, because it's at the very architecture, at the very core of depressive realism and philosophical pessimism. So it's kind of easier to, instead of trying to detach this bias, it's easier to just begin the depressive realism all over again. And this is going to be kind of my attempt. And the corresponding problem was this idea, the bias that intellect is initially historically understood as something that belongs to a figure of male, and because of that, the central figure of depressive realism is the suffering male, because they're smart ones, and accordingly, which means that women are this kind of bias goes together with the bias that intellect is male characteristic. So if woman is seen as naturally cheerful, happier, like naturally happy, because less mind and less despair, since despair and suffering are associated with the mind, with something, the reflection, not positioned in the world itself, but seen as a reflection of the world. So women are historically associated with nature. They're seen as someone closer to nature, to blissful harmony. It's more far away from the overdeveloped consciousness, and therefore less, more on a safe distance from this tragic consequence that uh, overdeveloped consciousness brings. That they're seen as a more grounded. And even in contemporary depressive realism, Colin Feltham would say that depressive realism is more commonly held among men than women. So even now we have this bias. So, which is a problem for me, because we know that depression is more common in women, and because of this bias that women naturally cheerful in their natural state, then even if they're depressed, even if they're more depressed according to statistics than men, we just see it as a deviation, because women is not supposed to be depressed. So depression is more easily stigmatized in women, which doesn't make sense, because there is more this kind of bias, because there is more depression in women, but nonetheless for women it's the deviation, and for men depression is more about this tragic consequences of existential despair, something like it. So her suffering is seen as dysfunction because of this assumption that she's naturally cheerful, even though women are more depressed. There are more diagnoses of depression in women than in men. And with the PMS thing, the PMS that occurs here at the end of the luteal phase, this thing is embodied, this bias is embodied in how we comprehend PMS, how we normally comprehend it as something to blame on our bad mood or our irrational behavior or being irritated. So because of the bias that women are naturally cheerful, this PMS is seen as the deviation from how woman's supposed to be, from deviation from how the proper female state of cheerfulness. And it's labeled as something to be corrected, as something that is not how we're not supposed to behave like or feel like. And there is this cultural script that comprehends women, that the women are only themselves during follicular phase, this one, and ovulation. So this is when we seen as who we're supposed to be, and when the progesterone and estrogen drop, and which makes us more irritated, more depressed or more sad or less prone to depression. This is seen as a deviation. This part of cycle is seen as something that it's the deviation from how women supposed to be. But so if you get rid of this bias, those are all stages that women go through. We can equally say, based on the, because the interpretation of the biological facts, it's just more or less cultural script. We can equally say that this is when women are themselves and the rest of it just the deviation. We can say that during the ovulation, this is when, so to say, hormonal cancellation works. We, the certain hormone, those hormones help us to bear, to comprehend, to bear illusion about the reality, to comprehend reality through illusion. So there's this hormonal cancellation at work, and this is when it stops working. This might be seen as who we actually are, so the other way around. And in this case, the PMS would be seen as embodiment of women, would be seen if this is where we are, where we are who we are at this stage during PMS, then we can be seen as, the women can be seen as embodiment of depressive realism. And I remember a meme that I saw a while ago, or was it a reel? It was about woman who liked a man, and then it turned out that she was ovulating, so it wasn't true. So it just it makes sense, of course, to see this this stage as of cycle, this phase as normality, because it might be easier for women to deal with herself. It might be easier for others to deal with herself. But nonetheless, it doesn't mean that if it's easier, then then her irritation during these stages might be inadequate. It can be equally seen as existential, as actually depressive realism, more closer comprehension of reality, more realistic comprehension of reality, one deprived of this comfort of those stages, the hormonal cancellation that was allowed because of the rise of estrogen and progesterone. So once this calming effect doesn't work and we lose the hormonal cancellation, this can be seen as actually women are more attuned to reality, and that's why they're more irritated, and there's more sense of despair here. So I would claim this is a joke, but nonetheless, there is something about it that PMS doesn't necessarily distort reality. It might just interrupt women's ability to cope with it, which means that if she only tries to murder you when she's on PMS, it doesn't mean that you don't deserve to be murdered. It just means that she has troubles to coping with something she was able to cope earlier. So from this point of view, PMS can be seen as embodiment, as a bodily, the embodied form of depressive realism, not a distortion. And the other problem, well, not the other problem, but just the problem with there are several problems with figuring out what feminist depressive realism could be. On one hand, they contradict each other because there is this misogynistic bias at the heart of at the core of depressive realism, and which is against feminism. But on the other hand, both feminism and depressive realism, at least certain forms of feminism, they coincide in certain problematic side of comprehension what is a woman. So at least the second wave feminism, what they're trying to do, like with Simone de Beauvoir, we were talking about it a little bit before. So feminism philosophy would claim that, well, for misogynistic comprehension, male-centered comprehension, man is at the center, man is seen as a proper human subject associated with intellect, and in depressive realism, it would be associated with, he would be associated with intellect, plus it would give man a certain type of profound suffering, which at the same time coincide with his greatness. So we have man at the center, associated with intellect, because of that associated with suffering. And then there is woman somewhere as a deviation, as this the other in comparison to man, not the proper human subject, associated with care, and all of these things women associated with are seen as less of a value, and more like secondary, less good than what man is associated. And because of this perspective, this male-centered initial perspective, what feminists try to do, at least Simone de Beauvoir, what they would try to do, they would try to put woman, if not at the central, then make her equal to man, and show that she is as she is supposed to be, or she deserves to be associated with intellect as much as man. But my problem is that we still preserve this initial, it kind of trying to, from this position, you still preserve the hierarchy of intellect initially associated with men, even if you put even if you put woman at the center, you kind of through this, you turn her into man. And from this perspective, you're going to have the rhetorics of repeating this diminishment of care and emotional labor as something secondary, as something one need to transcend, because intellectual capacity is still seen as superior. So we have problem here, and this won't work for me. So we can say that feminist depressive realism would just claim that women are also smart, therefore they're also suffering, but it would be just turning them into men, which we already, like, repeating this problematic structure. And the other thing, the problematic thing with combining feminism and depressive realism is that normally suffering of the woman, which feminism recognizes, it's associated with men mostly because of the male domination or exploitation or neglect. Like, they would still, suffering is not seen as universal, but as man is someone to blame for this kind of women suffering, which for me is problematic if we take this stance of this feminism for feminist depressive realism, because it still preserves this structure where man suffering is central, universal, and woman suffering is the reaction to this, to man. And it's kind of it's a certain form of flattery where the source of women suffering is reduced to men. For me, it's diminishing the suffering of the woman. So I would rather claim that the other way around, that women suffering is can be seen as something at the center. Women can be seen as embodied suffering, including all the things that they are associated with, like caring. And well, from this perspective, the embodiment of suffering is woman, not because she is equal to man, something like it, but kind of claiming that her suffering is substantial if we start with suffering that she represents without considering the man suffering. And this brings me to another thing, the chapter, the section where I'm talking about women being naturally cheerful once again, which might sound strange after all the troubles I went to trying to overthrow the bias that women are not cheerful, and comprehending it as misogynistic. But now in this final section, I would claim that, okay, women are cheerful. Schopenhauer might be happy to hear it. But even if we do, it's another claim that even if we comprehend women as cheerful, naturally cheerful, and even if we associate them or reduce them to childbirth and caregiving, it still means for me that they are true depressive realist, that the embodiment even of depressive realism. One can claim that depressive realism, because of this associating of the most profound despair with intellectual ability, with consciousness, with ability to reflect, so situating it in our mind, not in a world, it can be seen as instead escape from actual embodied suffering. And if you think about it, if one can reflect on suffering, if one can write books on suffering, they don't suffer that much. So if you have time to reflect, that's not that horrible. So maybe from this perspective, care might be suffering and despair, depression might be situated not in the reflection, in our ability to reflect, in our intellectual ability, but in the care itself, something that women are associated with. So depressive realism might be seen as just the theory of distancing, as something comforting, as escaping from real suffering, embodied suffering, into reflection, into, as a pose, in a way, constructed theory, which is not as bad as embodied suffering that women represent. So that's why I would say that intellect should instead be associated with the reduction of suffering. So intellect might be, the very ability to reflect might be seen as a reduction of suffering instead of more suffering. It might be less suffering if you're able to reflect. It might be reducing the ability to reduce suffering instead of get in touch with the suffering. And what women represents, the care and all of the things women are associated with, might be seen as embodiment of suffering that is so embodied you cannot even afford to reflect and to develop the theory of depressive realism. So suffering of the woman is embodied, and it might be worse than theory or theorizing about suffering. And the other thing was the women being cheerful. This is what I think we were mentioning last time too, that even if she is cheerful, or at least even if she appears to be cheerful, like Schopenhauer once wanted us to be cheerful, this cheerfulness itself can be seen as depressive realism, because I don't think it should be comprehended as something naive, but it can be seen as care. So it includes knowledge of the horror of the world, it includes suffering, but it kind of, on the top of that, it includes protection of protecting others from this knowledge. So it's not that women are cheerful. They might be seen as cheerful, but this cheerfulness might be seen as protecting others from the horror of the world that they know about, or even what that they represent with their body, with their embodiment. And being able to feel cheerful while representing this knowledge might be seen as a tragic grace. And so even if she's cheerful, it doesn't mean that she doesn't know. It means that it might mean that she knows, plus she's performing labor of carrying it without collapse and protecting others from this knowledge. So the tragedy of woman is not in her mood, but in her carrying the world. And that's my essay. And now I'll stop recording and we can proceed to something to discussion.